What's going on, everybody? We are back here with another episode of Watching the Meta. What are we doing this week? Well, we're watching the metagame. We're taking a look at the decks that were played over the weekend in Magic Online results and sometimes a little bit of paper results. There is a little bit of that this week, not too much, but this is really the last episode before the regional championship in Charlotte. So this is going to be kind of the last look that we're going to get to take a look and see what the metagame looks like heading into Charlotte. And let's just not waste any time. Let's get right into it. As we always do, we start with Modern here, and it doesn't really look that much different than last week, to be honest with you. There's a small uptick in Breach, along with a little bit of a downtick in Orzhov Blink. Boros did jump up a little bit from 11 to 17, so I guess that is pretty notable. It seemed like people were kind of waning off of Boros a little bit, given the fact that it has poor matchups, at least in my opinion, against both Breach and Orzhov Blink, and kind of to a lesser extent Eldrazi, which really has been falling off lately. We'll get to that in a second. So yeah, I'm not really a huge fan of Boros going into the weekend. That being said, it is still a very strong deck and does have the ability to win a lot of those quote-unquote bad matchups. You can adjust your sideboard cards and try and find some other plans for certain matchups that you need a little bit of help in. But yeah, Eldrazi has been taking a huge downtick too. 9.8 last week to 5.9 this week. For spoiler alert, Gruul Eldrazi is the deck that I'm going to be bringing, and not necessarily the Eldrazi deck that you would expect to see people play. We'll get to that a little bit later when we take a look at deck lists. But other than that, Domain Zoo, a little bit of an uptick here from 3.9 to 6.6. Surprisingly, Burn went from non-existent to 4.4%. Not really sure what happened there. Maybe that has to do with the slight downtick in Boros, although Boros was up from last week, so that wouldn't really explain that. But other than that, it's kind of the metagame that we expect. If you asked me a couple of weeks ago, I would have told you that Breach, Boros, Eldrazi, and Orzhov would be the four most played decks, and that's going to remain the case for a very long time, maybe until the March 31st ban announcement. So that is what I expect in Charlotte. I've been doing a lot of testing with different Eldrazi builds. And speaking of weird Eldrazi decks, that is where we are going to start here. From user Toxic1990 in 28th place, I believe on the Friday challenge. And when I started my testing, I was really in on kind of the more Karn-focused version of Eldrazi, because Karn is quite a good card against Grinding Breach. The problem is, Karn kind of sucks in every other matchup, so I've explored other avenues in terms of different builds of Eldrazi, and this is one that I happened to pick up a trophy with the other day, and one that I've been very impressed with. Now, you'll notice that there's no copies of Karn, which is a little scary for the Breach matchup, but the idea here is you are much more focused around this card, Harrogast Erupting Nullkite, where Harrogast is a card that has Emerge, so you can sacrifice either Myco Spawn or Chrysalis to it and cast Harrogast for 4 mana, and then once you have the Harrogast in play, it gives all of your other creatures Emerge. So your Emrakul the Promised End normally would cost 13 mana, 13 minus 9, which means the Emrakul only costs 4, but you still get the discount for card types in graveyard. So if you have 4 types in the graveyard and a Harrogast in play, you can just sack the Harrogast and cast the Emrakul for free. The reason I like this version so much is it is a lot more explosive. With those 4 drops, you have the ability to cast Emrakul as early as the 3rd turn of the game, and a lot of decks really just kind of lose on the spot to the first Emrakul trigger. And even if you need to have a second one, because this version is playing a second Sanctum of Ugin, where some builds, our recent builds, aren't even playing the first copy, so you're much more able to find those Emrakuls and kind of chain them off. So I like this version a lot. This is kind of where I'm going to be in Charlotte, and might change a couple of cards, but I really do like this version quite a bit. Speaking of that resurgence in Domain Zoo, I wanted to highlight this list because I've seen a few more people play this recently over the past couple of weeks, and it's been popping up here and there. Didn't think too much of it when I first saw it, but now that this version got 4th place, as you can see from Accelerado 444, and you kind of have to start respecting it a little bit more. Now, the best way I can describe this deck is it's sort of like Zoo Scam, where you have the normal Zoo stuff, right? You have Scion of Draco, Territorial Kavu, Leyline of the Guild Pact, and Leyline Binding. So that forms kind of this core of domain payoffs where you have 2 mana 4/4, 2 mana 5/5. You have the ley line of the Guild Pact plus Sign of Draco draws that are so good against Boros. But on top of that, you have some ways to kind of steal wins in matchups that you might not otherwise have a good matchup against. Because you have four copies of Doorkeeper Thrall to pair with 2 Null Drifter and 4 Flage Titan of Fire's Fury, where if you go turn 2 Doorkeeper Thrall, and then turn 3 you play either Null Drifter or Flage, you get to keep that creature in play. And if you happen to have an Arena of Glory to cast one of those 3-drops, you then give the creature that you just played haste. So you either have a hasty Flage or a hasty 4/4 flyer with, what's the ability? Annihilator. I knew that word. Annihilator 1. But on top of all of that, we have main deck Consigned to Memories. And no, this is not just because Eldrazi is everywhere. This is because Consigned to Memory can counter the Sacrifice ETB trigger on Flage or the Evoke trigger on Null Drifter. So you can actually sort of scam with both of those while having a card that is a very powerful main deck card against Eldrazi. So if you have a lot of Eldrazi in your metagame, this seems like a pretty reasonable deck to just pick up and have a decent matchup against them. So don't be surprised if this deck shows up in Charlotte. Next up from MCHLPP in 30th place, this is the Flicker deck, but not quite Orzhov. We did add a third color to this one. Now, a lot of these cards, if you've seen one of the Blink decks before, you're probably used to a lot of these. You have Relic of Progenitus to pair with Ketramos. You have Overlord of the Baelmerk plus Felia to have a very, very fast 5/5 creature that can recur other stuff. You have Solitude and Witch Enchanter, good cards to pick up off of Overlord of the Baelmerk. And then you have Ephemerate and Fatal Pushes, all that stuff. The reason that we are splashing blue is for Psychic Frog, which is an extremely powerful card, but the mana constraints may be a little bit awkward with stuff like Flicker Wisp and Double Black and Baelmerk and things like that. But the reason Psychic Frog is so powerful is it has the ability to exile 3 cards from your graveyard to give it flying, which happens to work very well with Ketramos. So if you're willing to maybe sacrifice a little bit in the mana base, you can get a much, much more powerful 2-mana creature that does, reliably have the ability to win the game by itself. If a Psychic Frog goes unchecked for a couple of turns, your opponent's in a lot of trouble. So if you want to add a little bit more power to the Orzhov Blink deck, I think this is a reasonable place to do that. And last up, we have a really spicy one here from the China Regional Championship that took place this past weekend. And this deck actually finished in the top 32 with a record, as you can see, of 6-2-1 in 19th place. And this is Death Shadow. Now, we haven't really seen a lot of Death Shadow do well over the past couple of weeks, probably because of the presence of Solitude. And Death Shadow is a little bit of a risky proposition in the face of that card. But if you can dodge the Solitude matchup, you have some new powerful tools here. So Mockingbird can not only copy your Death Shadow, but become a flying copy of it. And really, that's the only new card here. I love this deck list. It's just super clean. A bunch of 4-ofs, Fatal Push, Preordain, Stubborn Denial, Thoughtseize, Dismember. So a bunch of ways to pay life for Death Shadow, ways to copy Death Shadow, and ways to get the Death Shadow out fast. And you also have a couple of dress downs, which happen to work very well with Death Shadow, because if you say you have a 1/1 Death Shadow in play, because you're a 12 life, you then cast a dress down. The dress down means that the Shadow no longer has that -X clause, so it's just a 13/13. So it kind of acts as like this weird pseudo Teamer Battle Rage that also happens to be good against Solitude. So if you are a Death Shadow aficionado, maybe this is the time to play it. I'm not sure. Again, I'd be a little bit skeptical with all the Solitudes, but with the main deck dress downs, they might help you out a little bit. Next up, we are going to take a look at Pioneer. And as we've been saying over the past couple of weeks, not really a lot of churn. And what I mean by churn is not a ton of shifting in the metagame, where Gruul Prowess is basically the same. Rakdos Demons, slight uptick, 15 to 20 is somewhat noticeable. Dimir Bounce, a little bit of a downtick, so you could kind of just swap those two numbers around. And really everything else is the same. There's not really a ton of huge shaking changes here. And one thing that's been surprising to me and maybe this shouldn't surprise me given how large the card pool is in Standard, but the Gruul Prowess deck is basically the same deck that you can play in Standard with a couple of Kumano Faces Kakazans and a couple of Play with Fires. There's really not much else. They're still playing all of the Mice cards. Some are playing Innkeeper's Talent, Monstrous Rage. So it just seems like the Mice cards are really good, and turns out they're good in more than one format. I don't really have a lot else to say about this metagame, and until things shake up a little bit, there's not really a ton to talk about here. But we do have some interesting decks to take a look at. And I want to start here with Hernan72, because this is an individual who has been playing a lot of the blue-red, or is it in Soul deck over the past couple of weeks. They've basically placed in every single challenge, and it looks like this week they have decided to change the red to white as a small difference in secondary color. Now, the white upgrades that you get for the Ensoul deck, Mendicant Core Guidelight, which is an Aether Drift card, I was having quite a bit of success with this card in Standard, and I was waiting for somebody to give it a shot in Pioneer, and this seems like the perfect home for it, because you want to play a bunch of cheap artifacts anyways when you have Ensoul Artifact, and Core pays you off for having a bunch of cheap artifacts because it's a giant creature, but it also gives you the ability to start copying stuff like Portable Hole once you eventually get the 4 speed. Portable Hole, another excellent white card that we get to add to this deck by cutting the red. So you get the Mendicant Cores, you get 8 more Inspectors, so 4 Novice and 4 Thraben Inspector, to complement your 4 Spyglass Siren that you had before in Is It. I guess red had Voldaren Epic here, so you're going up to 12 from 8, not 12 from 4, effectively. It is a little interesting to me that there's only 3 copies of Ensoul Artifact, but white also gives you the ability to play Sheltered by Ghosts, which is a fantastic card, and also gets quite a bit better when you have a 2-mana 5/5. The last card that I want to highlight here is an odd one, so you have Simulacrum Synthesizer. Now, if you look at this deck list, there's not really a ton of artifacts that trigger Simulacrum Synthesizer. It's really just Synthesizer itself. But we do have a little bit of an affinity angle here with Memory Guardian. And Memory Guardian, again, paired with all of those 12 Inspectors that you have for 1 mana that makes an artifact, you can cast Memory Guardian pretty quickly for cheap, and that will trigger Synthesizer, which, again, Synthesizer works with all the cheap artifacts. You kind of get the idea. So an interesting take on the Ensoul deck. Not sure if I 100% buy the Synthesizers, but it is definitely something that caught my eye. Next up here, shout out to Claudio, who got 15th place in a recent challenge, and you maybe recognize a lot of these cards if you've been keeping an eye on our Standard content. I had an obscene run with Goblins not too long ago. I want to say it was maybe a couple of weeks ago at this point, and in Standard, and it seems like a lot of those Goblins do translate pretty well into Pioneer. A lot of the cards that you see here, Burnout Bastronaut, Draconautics Engineer, Fanatical Firebrand, Howl Squad Heavy, Krenko, and Horde Master, all these cards are legal in Standard. You can play every single one of them. They were all in the deck that I played in Standard. So the big difference is here, the upgrade you get, really the standout for me is Conspicuous Snoop. This card has been an all-star in Modern Goblins for the longest period of time, and turns out that it also happens to be pretty good in Pioneer, where it just allows you to cast more spells from the top of your library, and it just provides an endless stream of card advantage. And it also works very well with the Runveld Horde Master, because as your stuff dies, you know what you're hitting for the Horde Master trigger because you see the top card of your library. Yeah, I mean, you also get to play Fable the Mirror Breaker, which you don't get to play in Standard, and I heard that card's pretty good. Not too bad. The other cool thing that Fable allows you to do is it makes your Cauldrons a lot better, because what you want to do is you want to ideally put a Krenko under Soul Cauldron, and it's a lot easier to do that when you have the ability to discard Krenko, immediately put it into the graveyard, play the Cauldron, pop off from there. So this looks pretty interesting. You get some ringleaders in the sideboard, which you don't get in Standard, but I like the way this deck looks, and I was a big fan of the deck in Standard. It's probably pretty good in Pioneer too. Only one more deck for a Pioneer here. There wasn't a ton else that I could find past this that looked kind of interesting, but I wanted to highlight this one. Now, there have been quite a few people picking up Dimir Bounce in Pioneer. Again, another port over from Standard. Pioneer just seems kind of like standard plus at this point. But this one looked a little bit interesting, not quite like the rest of the other bounce decks, because this one's only playing 60 cards. They're not playing Yorion, and almost every other version of bounce that I saw had Yorion. The other differences here is this one is playing 3 Oil Deep Gearhulks and 4 copies of Rottenmouth Viper. Now, Viper is an interesting card because it is powerful with all these cheap cards like Hopeless Nightmare, Storm Chaser's Talent, and Spyglass Siren, but it's just interesting to see like this collection of cards, because the more that I look at this, I'm wondering why people haven't tried Rottenmouth Viper in the bounce decks in Standard. I wonder. Maybe that'll be a YouTube video at some point. But yeah, this one looks pretty cool. If you're into the bounce stuff, if you like it in Standard, it's pretty good in Pioneer too. And last but certainly not least, let's take a look at Standard. Now, as you can see here, Esper Pixie, turns out it's a pretty good deck. Esper Pixie won 3 of the 5 Standard challenges. Well, there was 4 challenges and a showcase. The showcase was won by Pixie. So a lot of Pixie winners here this weekend, although in terms of the overall metagame, it's really not that big of a change. It's went from 11.3 to 11.9. So it's not like Pixie is a third of the metagame. It's just happened to have a very good weekend. As far as the rest of the metagame, Gruul Prowess, slight downtick, Domain, slight downtick. And those numbers, if you think about it from this perspective, the Gruul downtick was basically swap with Mono Red, and the Domain downtick was basically swap with Azorius Control, which had a very, very good weekend, 10% of the metagame. It did win a challenge, and overall, I have to say, I've been very impressed with the Azorius Control deck. It's not really a deck that I would personally ever want to play myself, but I at least have to respect how well it's doing, and it seems like it has a reasonable matchup spread. You have a good plan against Domain because you're kind of just mono Jaces. You have a decent enough plan against Red because you have a pile of sweepers, so can't be that bad. Other than that, Jeskai Convoke, small uptick, Gruul lane line, bit of an uptick as well. Nothing too crazy past that. Orzhov Pixie, 6.3% last week, basically non-existent this week. That one seemed to have been a little bit more of a flash in the pan. I will say I still like the Orzhov Pixie deck, but a lot more people wanted to play it last week because of how well it did at the PT, and this week maybe they're less interested in that. But that's not to say that I don't believe in the deck still, because I definitely do. As far as some interesting decks that we have here for you, first one I want to take a look at is from Owl1013, who got 15th place in the one of the challenges this weekend. And this is a different take on the Simulacrum Synthesizer deck, which we just saw in Pioneer. But this one is Dimir, and I like the way this looks. This is sort of what I like to call the no-nonsense approach, where I feel like a lot of times when people play Repurposing Bay, they tend to put a lot of like weird one-ofs in their deck that they don't ever want to draw, that are only good in situations where you can tutor for them off Bay. There's not really any tutor targets. And what I mean by no nonsense is you've identified the best thing to do with Repurposing Bay is just get more copies of Synthesizer. So why even bother with the pod targets anyways, if you're just going to put more Synthesizers into play either way? And by cutting all of those janky one-ofs that you really don't want to search for or draw half the time anyways, you now have room to play Talon plus Town, which is an extremely powerful engine. You can also use Town to bounce Repurposing Bay to get more Synthesizer triggers, or heaven forbid, Oil Deep Gearhulk. So you can do a lot of cool stuff that way. Again, really just like the cleanliness of how this deck looks. And if I was to play Repurposing Bay again, I'd probably give this one a shot. Shout out to Jaffer in 32nd place here, a man after my own heart, with Gastal, Thrill Whirler, and Bloodgast. I love these sacrifice decks. I want a reason to play them. I don't think they're that well positioned in the metagame right now, but I can appreciate the additions of Thrill Roller and Bloodgast into this deck, because you have a bunch of ways to discard and sacrifice creatures anyways, like Fear of Missing Out, discarding Bloodgast, Disturbing Mirth, or Final Vengeance, sacrificing Bloodgast. So you have a lot of ways to utilize that stuff. And then the cool thing about Thrill Roller is it can also be a discard outlet. So if you have a Thrill Roller in play and a Bloodghast in the, or I guess a Thrill Roller in the graveyard, you can discard a Bloodghast to get back the Thrill Roller and kind of pop off from there. I wish these decks were a little bit better positioned because they're super fun to play, but shout out to Jaffer for being the hero that we don't deserve. Speaking of goblins, you might recognize this username, Quiniac. This is the Quintanole who's been doing very, very well at the PTs over the past couple of PTs. And actually the individual who we got the initial goblins list from the first time, they ran it back in the Showcase Challenge, this time with more Agatha Soul Cauldrons, which is a card you saw in the Pioneer version. Now, it's not quite as good in this version because we don't have the Fables to discard Krenkos, but we still have 4 copies of Krenko. You have a Grease Wrench Goblin, which you can use to discard Krenko, but for the most part, you just want to cast it and just kind of put it into play, make your opponent answer it, because if you untap with it, you kind of win the game. Or if you have Howl Squad Heavy, you don't even need to untap with it, you just tap at the turn you play it. But then if they do answer the Krenko, you have the Cauldrons to kind of pop off from there. A lot of the same stuff here: Burnout Bastronaut, Cacophony Scamp at 1, Horde Master, Seer Slicer Goblin, which is a card that the Pioneer version didn't play, mostly because they're replacing this with Cacophony Scamp, so you have a better 2-drop anyways, but Seer Slicer is pretty good, especially when you're playing 4 Horde Master and 4 Dropkick Bomber, so you have 8 Lords, which kind of pay you off for going wider, so I like that. And Howl Squad Heavy has just been an absolute beating. The more I play with this card, the more I realize how powerful this card is, and I definitely underrated this one during spoiler season. So if you are a fan of goblins, I would highly recommend this one. And last but certainly not least, from Tamir1313 in 31st place, we have Is It Monument. Now, when I say Is It Monument, you might be thinking of the version that we played not too long ago with Artist Talent and Monument to Endurance. This is not quite that. This is a much more aggressively slanted version of Monument, where you're playing both Marauding Mako and Scrounging Skyray to pay you off for discarding a bunch of cards, which you can do with Fear of Missing Out, NT, and Steam Core Scholar. All of those cards happen to draw cards, so they work well with profs. You get the idea. And because you have so many discard outlets to trigger Monument, that's kind of cool too. The one new card that I want to highlight here that I have not really seen anybody play, and I kind of like the more I think about it, is Irreverent Gremlin. This is kind of a weirdo from Duskmourn, 2/2 menace, and whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters under your control, you can discard a card, draw a card. You only do it once each turn, but it happens to work very well with Makos and Skyrays that you then happen to draw later on, because those will trigger the Gremlin, which means they will sort of trigger themselves and start the discard train going. And Gremlin also draws cards for profs. So it's a bit of a weirdo, but I kind of like it if you're playing this high of a creature count. So something to keep in mind if you're interested in kind of the blue-red profs, Monument, Shell, maybe try out some more Irreverent Gremlins. And folks, that is going to do it for another episode of Watching the Meta. I hope you guys enjoyed. As always, thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comment section, what was your favorite deck from today's episode? There is a lot to choose from, so make sure you choose wisely. If you made it to the end of the video, consider liking if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel for more epic content, and until next week, adios.